Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I want to start off by thanking all of you for choosing to speak with us on this very critical topic today. I think it is crucial for your voices to be amplified so that the interlocutors in the Afghan peace process can further understand the needs of localities, different localities in Afghanistan, and the complexity of the subject matter. I want to thank, first of all, the panelists, the outstanding panelists for joining us today. And I also want to thank the people in our audience and would like to let them know that they will have a chance to engage with our panelists during the Q&A session. Before starting our panel today, I will take some time to briefly introduce our guest speakers to you and give a brief background of what we are going to discuss today, so that our audience can engage with us during the Q&A session. With that being said, we are very lucky to have some of the outstanding panelists with us today. And let me start by Dr. Michael Gugelman. Dr. Michael is the Deputy Director at Asia Program. He is South Asia Senior Associate to Wilson Center with main focus on Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and Bangladesh. Next on our panel, we have Ahmad Shuja Jamal. Ahmad Shuja Jamal is the Director of International Affairs and Regional Cooperation at the Office of the National Security Council in Afghanistan. We also have with us Professor Muscada Stagir. Muscada Stagir is Lecturer of Peace, Security, and Gender Studies at the American University of Afghanistan, and she is a Special Advisor for Joint Task Force for Anti- and Counter-Corruption. Last but not the least, we have Mr. Faisal Sherzai with us. Faisal Sherzai is the Deputy Governor of Kandahar. He will be specifically talking to us in regards to the spike in violence in Kandahar province and their coordination, the coordination of the provincial units with the central government. So with that being said, I want to say that each of our panelists will have 2 questions to answer, and they will have 4 to 7 minutes with a possibly follow-up question if we think further clarification is a necessity and important. With that being said, I will go briefly to the background. In the aftermath of the U.S.-Taliban bilateral agreement, as well as since the beginning of the Intra-Afghan dialogues in Doha, the Taliban have accelerated their battlefield engagement for many reasons, namely to speak from a stronger bargaining position. Given that there has been a lot of engagement on why the Taliban have accelerated their unconventional warfare, the other side of the coin remain unheard. For us in Mastooraat, the other side of the coin is the long-lasting effects of the use of violence on both the Afghan peace process and the post-peace settlement. In order to spike a debate, today we are organizing this expert engagement. Thank you everyone for joining us once again. I would like to especially thank our panelists today for joining us and taking their time. So with that being said, if there are no comments from the panelists, we can kick off the discussion. I think I will start with Dr. Michael for our first question. Dr. Michael, my question to you is that regional rivalries play an important part in war in Afghanistan. It's important for us to note that it's not only the Pakistan and Afghanistan, the Pakistan and India regional rivalry that disrupts peace in Afghanistan. It is also that U.S. and Iran rivalry can also play a role in disrupting the overall peace in Afghanistan. Given that last time when Soleimani was targeted by the U.S., Iran promised to retaliate and take revenge. Now, today, their scientist is also dead. What do you think are the implications of the U.S.-Iran rivalry on the overall peace in Afghanistan, on both the current talks and the post-peace socio-political? Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for having me, for including me in this very important, very difficult conversation, but nonetheless a very important one. I really have great admiration for what your organization does. I think it's so important, and I'm grateful to be a part of this discussion. So to get you to your question, indeed, I think that it's important to look at the current state of play in Afghanistan from a broader regional lens, and particularly in terms of destabilization risks and drivers of that destabilization and violence. And you talk about Iran. Iran certainly potentially has a very attractive retaliatory target in Afghanistan in terms of going after the US. It's got, Iran it basically looks across its border and sees a few thousand US troops that are in Afghanistan, at least for now. But a few points on this matter of Iran and US-Iran rivalry. First, I think that Iran is more likely to try to engage in destabilizing acts if its relationship with the US is particularly bad, and it's very bad right now, as you've just outlined. But we will have to see how the US-Iran relationship evolves once the Biden administration comes into office. As you know, President-elect Biden wants to ease tensions a bit with Iran, and he wants to try to re-enter the nuclear deal that President Obama had helped broker some time ago. But that will be very hard. Now, if Biden's administration is able to ease tensions, even if modestly, with Iran, then I think that Iran would have less incentive to try to retaliate against the US in Afghanistan. Second point on this is that ever since the Taliban concluded its agreement with the US in February, Tehran, I think, has less incentive and less ability to hit back at the US through the Taliban. And with the US-Taliban deal, theoretically, the Taliban is no longer targeting US troops. Of course, tragically, it's targeting just about everyone else, but it's not targeting US troops. So I don't think it would make sense for Iran to arm the Taliban in the hopes that the Taliban would then target the US. But what I fear that Iran could do instead is try to reinvigorate some of these Shia militias in Pakistan and Afghanistan that Iran has previously used as proxies to help it service its interests in the Middle East, including fighting ISIS in Syria. This is something that Iran potentially could do, and it will remain a threat, particularly so long as US troops are in Afghanistan, and otherwise try to use those militias to target US forces. Third, and finally, a broader point, my sense is that Iran disagrees with the US on so much, but their interests, broadly speaking, in Afghanistan are similar. Iran, I believe, does support the peace process. It wants it to succeed. It will not try to sabotage it. And there are so many potential spoilers of this current peace process, but I don't think that Iran is one of them. Finally, there are certainly other rivalries to watch out for as well, other than US-Iran, in terms of those that could affect the stability situation in Afghanistan. Russia, like Iran, is a US foe, and like Iran, it wants the peace process to succeed, but it's also seeking to undercut the US. And unlike with the US-Iran relationship, there's not much hope that the US-Russia relationship will improve under the Biden administration. So the prospects of Moscow trying to undercut the US in Afghanistan cannot be overstated. There's also China, which does not have a security presence in Afghanistan and has restricted its footprint to political and diplomatic efforts to kickstart talks. Afghanistan is one place in Asia that is not a battleground for US-China rivalry, I think, given that China's footprint is light and its overall objectives align with those of the US. But the main takeaway in this story, and I'll end here, is that some of America's most bitter rivals are Afghanistan's neighbors, right? Iran, China, Russia. And so long as the US continues to have a footprint and a presence in Afghanistan, its rivalries with these countries will always lurk, even if they won't necessarily result in violence.
Thank you so much, Doctor. This makes very much sense. So now I will go to our second question. We were planning to ask this question first so that we can understand what's going on the ground. And this question is referred to Mr. Faisal Sherzai. Mr. Faisal Sherzai, on November, the Taliban launched an offensive in Kandahar. This offensive was quite similar and comparable to that of the Helmand, an evident attempt to seize the whole city, or perhaps the districts that are very close to city. Firstly, I want to ask you, how do you evaluate the response of the Afghan National Security Forces in thwarting the attempt of the Taliban without the support of international troops? Now, secondly, throughout the process of defending the city, let me ask you that how did you face any type of communication barriers with the central government, given that our system of government is highly centralized? Are you satisfied with the assistance of the central government to your local administration? Over to you.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank the entire team of Mastooraat and the viewers who are participating in this event, especially Muska, who's Naya here in the event, Mr. Michael, Shuja, and Jamshed yourself. I want to tell the entire world, especially the Taliban, the fight is not the solution to peace and stability. Taking or becoming or taking power by force is not a solution. Whatever they are doing right now is completely wrong. Killing their own brothers, their own people for other countries, or taking the decisions from other countries. I don't believe it's a solution for them to, take power by force. Now, let me come straight to the question. The plans the opposite or the Taliban have, they did not reach what they wanted, because we are very well satisfied and we have a very good communication with the central Kabul. What we do is, before they launch or they do anything such as what they did in Helmand, the entire city of Kandahar was aware of what they are planning to do. So we are very well satisfied. And right now, what we are doing is that each and every brother, I want to tell each and every brother who's living in Afghanistan, it's time for us to get together and stand against these crimes. Taking power is not the solution by force.
Thank you so much. Can you also specifically tell us about what is going on in the districts like Arghandab, Panjwai, in Dant? Are the attempts to take those districts thwarted by by our forces?
Yes, first of all, what happened last 2 weeks before, what Taliban did is we had some miscommunication with the district, which was Tadin's decision where to put police, where to put the military. Military belongs to another group of government. What Tadin did, he wanted to change, he wanted to bring some changes, and it did not work well. That was one of the reasons the entire Arghandab was taken by Taliban. And Alhamdulillah, the government is very strong enough, to take over them again and to take over Arghandab very easily. We had a very well communication with the central, and again, we had good communication with the forces who were inside Arghandab.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Mr. Shuja Jamal, now I come to you for a very important question. My question is that as the gridlocks unfold in the Doha talks, we start to revisit the terms and conditions of the U.S.-Taliban bilateral agreement, wherein there is specifically a provision related to the release of 7,000 Taliban fighters. I have two questions in regarding this. And now, number one is that when is this provision exactly going to be enacted within the Doha talks? Is in the intra-Afghan dialogues? Is it going to be at the beginning, middle, or somewhere towards the end? Second question is that if the release of 7,000 more Taliban has to happen before any type of agreement on how to end the war, what is the position of the government in respect to this provision, given that the government was not a party to the U.S.-Taliban bilateral agreement? And the last question is that if at some point the government accepts to release these prisoners, how would they implement this process in order for them not to join the war again? Because a lot of the 5,000 released Taliban went and fought against the government. Over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mr. Mohammadi, for organizing this, and thank you to Mastooraat, the organization, for organizing a very timely panel on an important issue and bringing together some very important people. It's very nice to meet all of you, Mr. Sherzai, yourself as well. Thank you for your update. If you allow me, Mr. Mohammadi, to go back to sort of refer to the fundamentals of the webinar, which is the use of violence and its long-lasting effects. If you allow me to sort of have some comments on that before I come to your question, that would be very much appreciated. But also, before I do that, I'd like to have a couple of observations about how you set up this, conversation. I think you used the term, the Taliban have intensified their, quote, battlefield engagement, and they have intensified their, quote, unconventional warfare. I think those are extremely generous terms for what is daily acts of terrorism against civilians, against the government, against public infrastructure. So I would like to refer us back to what the current violence by the Taliban is, which is daily acts of terrorism against civilians, against our system of representative Republican democracy, but also in many cases against public infrastructure, roads, television stations, power structures. You saw this in Helmand. So it's important for us to get our terms right. I understand Mastooraat may have other considerations, but I just wanted to bring that up to you. The Afghan government is obviously, we've shown this, we are dedicated to pursuing a path to peace through negotiations. We have shown this in our efforts to offer ceasefires, not once, but multiple times. The ceasefire in June of 2018 was really as a result of a unilateral attempt and an announcement by the Afghan government, which was only then reciprocated by the Taliban. We've also made goodwill gestures to the Taliban with respect to their convicts, 5,500 of which were released, many of them promptly joining the battlefield in contravention to their own personal assurances, but also assurances the Taliban gave to the Afghan government and to the US. And we've also engaged in good faith in the negotiations in Doha since the 12th of September, which was the first day of the talks. And so while the government will not step back from our all-out efforts on the negotiating table, we also recognize that a peace deal after 20 years of violence and terrorism, mainly perpetuated by the Taliban, will not resolve all that ails our country. The immediate threat for bodily harm will probably cease largely, which is a big enough outcome as it is. But the more important matter is governance, the economy and human rights and society that will have long-term intergenerational effects. So if you allow me to go back to the original title and make some comments about the long-term effects of the use of violence and terrorism on the policy realm, I would appreciate that. I think I will talk about the long-term use of violence very briefly, sketch out a couple of brief overviews on fiscal issues in the realm of policy, economic issues, human rights, and the reputational issues that violence brings to the Afghan people and our nation and our government. As you know, entitlement payments to martyrs and people with disability are a statutory obligation of the Afghan government under Afghan law, and continued violence will only make that an increasing part of our national budget, which will naturally squeeze away investments in other much needed areas such as health and education. Pensions, but also ekramia, payments to the families of NDSF, also mandated under statute and under regulations, will continue to require a larger portion of our investments. And these are not just for today, but these are long-term intergenerational, multi-decadal, perhaps even longer than that, effects on our system. Entitlement reform is a major policy issue in advanced economies. Michael Kugelman could attest to this because the US, actually, the government is struggling to keep the pension funds solvent as fiscal stressors are squeezing the budgets. On the economy side, the perpetual use of violence not only suppresses the opportunity for economic growth, as we've seen in our own economy, but it also makes development uneven. In places like Kandahar, even though they're violence stricken and the areas have received more development, they've also received more development money, they've also had less development. So more money for less progress is what and that has perpetual long-term impact. And so violence not only chills foreign investment, foreign companies can't really come to Afghanistan, but it also scares away indigenous capital. we call them in Dari Tujarai Milli, seek to safeguard their wealth and they take it to Dubai and to other places. And that's a long-term issue because capital, once invested elsewhere, is less mobile to come back to Afghanistan. On human rights, the Taliban's violence makes it hard for Afghanistan to meet its obligations under international law. And as an example, we can talk about, say, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, where Article 3 requires that the best interests of the child should be the primary consideration in all matters of legislation and policymaking or private and public undertakings. Well, this is difficult in the best of circumstances, in the most advanced economies, but it is damn near impossible in a scenario of perpetual terrorism. And what happens when we fail to actually invest in our youth? That has intergenerational effect. And similarly on other issues, and Convention on the Rights of Minorities, Indigenous people, women, and all other areas. And so the final impact of long-term impact is really reputational. A state, say Afghanistan, that is incapable of meeting our human rights obligations, that is unable to become fiscally self-reliant or economically prosperous, will always be under increasing negative international attention. And that is something that will haunt us for a very, very long time because of it. So the Taliban's violence is not just causing reputational damage to Afghanistan at this moment, it will continue to do so in the foreseeable future, even if there is a peace deal that ceases most of the Taliban violence. So it will take a long, long time for Afghanistan to recover and become a nation in good standing. And the reason why I keep singling the Taliban out in terms of violence is because they are really the main perpetrators of violence in this country. And where they're not directly responsible for violence, they provide an overarching umbrella where other organizations like Daesh and others could actually come, plan, stay, and conduct their operations because the government is too busy fighting the Taliban and the threats that emanate from them. So that is really just a sketch of the long-term effects of violence and the Taliban's terrorism. Going back to your questions about the Doha, look, the Afghan government was not really a party to the U.S.-Taliban deal. However, we support the U.S.-Taliban deal as an important document because it provides us one of the best opportunities for a peaceful resolution to the conflict that is ongoing in this country. We are not bound by any of its provisions. However, we actually have, as a gesture of goodwill, released 5,500, and not just 5,000 under the U.S.-Taliban deal, of convicts of the Taliban. To create goodwill and open the path for negotiations in Doha with the Taliban. And that should be taken as a gesture of goodwill, not as a gesture of us being obligated by the US-Taliban deal. Although we do support that deal because it's an important diplomatic achievement and it enables a lot of other progress in our efforts toward peace. Now, this whole talk about 7,000 additional Taliban being released is the same category. We are not obligated to release a single Taliban convict, all of whom are actually convicts, all of them convicted in some of the most heinous crimes against Afghans, but also against the interests of our partners and allies, the US chief among them, but also other NATO member countries, civilians, UN employees have been targeted, ICRC employees have been targeted and killed and kidnapped by these people who are behind bars as we speak. And so the Afghan government's main objective is to call for an immediate relief from the violence for the Afghan people. We do not think that the release of the 7,000 people at this moment is warranted or earned. The Taliban have clearly signaled that over 10% of the 5,500 already released have gone back to the battlefield, even though the Taliban had actually assured us in the presence of the US, but also each of the 5,500 it released individually assured us that they would not join the battlefield again, but they actually have. And they're not just foot soldiers, they've actually received commission to be so-called shadow district governors, shadow commanders, and planners and recruiters. And those are really official positions that the Taliban have to respond and answer for. And I think before any single additional release happens, those are some of the considerations that should be addressed. And like I said, we have to sequence everything as a result of the outcome in the negotiations in Doha, but those are our considerations. And our number one priority is to give a reprieve to our people from the daily relentless acts of terrorism by the Taliban. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for the insightful input on the long-lasting effects of the use of violence. This is exactly what we are, why we organized this webinar, to talk about the long-lasting effects of the use of violence, both on the current talks and the post-peace settlement. In our background, theoretically speaking, we said that the use of violence will lead to negative peace in Afghanistan, where only the absence, where there only be the absence of war, but structural violence will still continue. So thank you for that. And I think I will go to the question, to another question to Dr. Michael right now, because I think it is very relevant since you point out about the terminologies of unconventional warfare. So I would go to the second question for Dr. Michael. Dr. Michael, some Afghan watchers and expert, quote unquote, on the Afghan peace process and on the Afghan war in general, term the war in Afghanistan as civil war, to which I completely disagree for a number of reasons. Given that the war in Afghanistan is heavily supported by a regional player, how do you define war in Afghanistan? Given that they're considering the insurgency warfare and the proxy warfare, in these terms, how would you put the war in Afghanistan? Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Another great question, and I really value the comments from my co-panelists before. And very briefly, before getting to your question, just to add on, I think, to the very useful inputs that Shuja put out there about the potential longer-term impacts of unending violence in Afghanistan. I think that if you look at this really far down the road, not next year, but the next few years, next 5 to 10 years, if this violence continues and continues, I think that it'll make it very difficult for Afghanistan to be in a position to focus on new types of threats, non-traditional security threats that will be there regardless of the level of violence. And here I'm thinking about things like climate change, for example, which everyone is dealing with. But Afghanistan, of course, is particularly vulnerable to climate change. And it's going to come to a point where that becomes a top priority for all countries, but obviously for a country like Afghanistan, which faces so many constraints to start with, and if it's dealing with unending violence, unending war, it's going to be very difficult. And it would seem like a luxury, like a pure abstraction, to think about something like climate change when you're dealing with more immediate impacts, more immediate threats posed by war and violence. But that's getting a bit further down the road. To your question, how should we define the war in Afghanistan as insurgency or proxy warfare? I guess, it's an interesting question. It's tough to answer. I would describe it as both, but I would think that at least now, maybe more of the former than the latter. Certainly, as you note, as you describe, the war is heavily supported by regional players. Well, certainly, Pakistan may support the Taliban. It may give shelter to the Taliban, or it has done these things. Iran has indeed provided some levels of military support to the Taliban. The Saudis in the past have provided different types of support. But to me, speaking as someone, as an independent analyst on the outside, the Taliban still strikes me. Yes, you could describe the Taliban as a terrorist organization, which it is, even though the U.S. government has never designated the Afghan Taliban as a terrorist group, though it has the Haqqani network faction. At any rate, to me, the Taliban does seem to be at its roots an anti-state insurgency. I think it would be incorrect to suggest that the Taliban is effectively stage managed internally and made to be a pawn in some grand regional proxy war. I don't think that's how things are right now. The Taliban draws recruits from within Afghanistan, and people join the Taliban for a variety of reasons. Some just want a paycheck, others oppose the US presence, others still are radicalized and believe in the ideology of the Taliban. And there are others that join because they oppose their government. Taliban propaganda does try to cast the Afghan government as an entity that's not worth supporting because it's corrupt, doesn't provide basic services, a stooge of America. This is the propaganda we've heard for many years. And it does play the hearts and minds game, or tries to, in rural spaces by stepping in to serve the role of a shadow state and providing services. And the Taliban, the funding sources of the Taliban are tough to know for sure, but it does draw significant portions of its funding internally through the drug trade and other illicit industries like timber, for example. So I think that the bottom line is that the Taliban's recruits, its grievances, its funding it really is local to a significant extent. And therefore, while it does look to and depends on external support, particularly in terms of sanctuaries across the border in Pakistan, despite all that, it is very much a local phenomenon. Now, I think that down the road, the war in Afghanistan could become afflicted by a lot more of this proxy conflict. If you look at a scenario under which unfortunately I think is quite likely, if the US leaves, if peace talks flounder, and the security situation gets worse, Afghanistan's neighbors at that point will try to do what they can to secure their interests, including siding with friendly forces. And this is when the India-Pakistan proxy war could heat up. It's when Iran could jump into the fray, and so on. So bottom line is, I think that at this point, this notion of proxy war, certainly it's there, but I think that's something that stands to intensify and become acute more so down the road if in a post-America Afghanistan type scenario.
Thank you very much, Dr. Michael, for the insight. I think it's very relevant to our second question that I am going to ask Mr. Shuja Jamal. So, Mr. Shuja Jamal, theoretically speaking, when it comes to insurgency warfare, that's how we define the war in Afghanistan, or proxy warfare at least, the state has tangible assets, for example, military capacity compared to the challengers of the state. But in the case of Afghanistan, we know that the government of Afghanistan overrides the military capacities of the Taliban because of international support, which is now largely conditioned on the peace process and the results of the peace process. Given that if things disrupt in the Afghan peace process does not go the way we want to, the way the Afghan government or international community wants to, how is our national security forces prepared to defend the country without the international support? Which now we are talking about a very worst case scenario, God forbid.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. Again, that's a very thoughtful question. Before I get to your question, just as a theoretical, if we engage into that question of civil war, if we take the Taliban to be a terrorist organization using terrorist means, is the war against an organization like that a civil war, or is that a war against terrorism? I think that's something that needs to be engaged with as we try to characterize what is going on here. To get to your question, look, I said very early on in my comments that the Afghan government is not walking away from the negotiations in Doha. We are going to do our best. The president's orders are pretty clear. We're not walking away and we're not giving in. So no giving up and no giving in. However, there is a point where the Taliban are going to make progress impossible. Nobody wants to get to that point. Our preparations are to actually make this historic opportunity one that actually finally brings peace to Afghanistan. We do not want to be in a place of fighting perpetual war against the Taliban or against any other proxy groups or terrorist organizations on our soil. However, to answer your question about what happens when the international troops leave, I think since approximately 2015, when the over 100,000 American troops started leaving and other countries started drawing down their troops, the Afghan government and our Afghan National Defense and Security Forces have been doing an increasingly large part of the war fighting. And ever since the signing of the U.S.-Taliban deal on the 29th of February of 2020, the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces have been doing 96% of all of the fighting this year. And so even though nobody wants to be engaged in a perpetual battle in our country because you want peace, but the alternative is that ANDSF already has been doing virtually all of the fighting. Now, of course, on occasion, we've received extremely effective and very much welcome international support, especially and including, as an example, in the battle of the Taliban's battle in Lashkargah, which repelled them decisively, in some other places. But ANDSF, and if you take John Sopko, who is the Special Inspector General on Afghanistan Reconstruction, his report a few weeks ago said that in the third quarter of 2020, the Afghan Special Forces, this is not ANDSF writ large anymore, the Special Forces have conducted 98% of all of their operations fully independently. What that means is intelligence gathering, operational planning, execution, air support, but also post-operational assessment. Not even international advisors were involved in any of those efforts. So 98% of our special forces operations have been carried out independently, completely independently. These are not our figures, these are US figures. So that, I think, gives you a picture of what is to be expected should the violence drag on indefinitely. But I would also like to point out that yesterday, the North Atlantic Council, which is the governing body for NATO, issued a statement saying that NATO remains committed to Afghanistan, to the Afghan people, and to the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. So those are their words: Afghanistan, the Afghan people, and the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. NATO in November also actually renewed its commitment to the Afghan National Army Trust Fund, which is what funds the Afghan National Army, up to 2024. So we not only have the money for the next 4 years, we also have the support of NATO member countries. The 20 some odd, actually, maybe it's probably 40 some odd, please don't quote me, but that's the approximate number of countries that are part of NATO. All of them unequivocally issued a statement promising and pledging their support and commitment to the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think personally, as an Afghan civilian, this is a very good news to me, and I'm very happy about it. So to conclude our panel, I will ask the last question from Dr. Michael, given the fact that two of our guest speakers had to leave earlier, and because we don't want to take any more time of you, we will end with this last question, and we will not be able to take Q&A session, do the Q&A session for today's discussion. So our last question is from you, Dr. Michael. Dr. Michael, Imran Khan visited Afghanistan earlier this month. And this was considered a diplomatic boost for both of the countries because of the fact that it created some hopes that there will be constructive role of the Pakistan played in the Afghan peace process. Now, how do you analyze the role of Pakistan in the current spike in violence across the city, across the country during the Afghan peace process?
Well, thank you very much. Another great question. Just before I get to it, I thought that Shuja made some really important points once again. Just one brief comment in response, and I would be curious if there's time for him to respond to my response. I think that his comments about the increasing role that the ANSF are playing in operations by lowering significantly their dependence on foreign forces, that's a really important message. I think especially it's one that the world needs to hear. But my concern as an analyst is if you do have a continued drawdown of US forces, in particular to the point where it could potentially become a zero presence in Afghanistan, how does that impact the ability of the ANSF to keep Taliban offensives out of cities? I think that in the past, as I understand it, US air power has oftentimes been requested to help Afghan ground forces expel these attempted Taliban ingresses into cities. So I guess that would be my question as to what would be the impact for the ANSF of a US withdrawal for the ability to hold urban spaces. But in terms of your question about Pakistan is so critical to any discussion about Afghanistan, the peace process, and unfortunately typically for the wrong reasons. But I think that the Imran Khan visit was successful in that it resulted in new pledges of cooperation in a variety of spaces. There was nothing earth-shattering about that trip. As you know, there are frequently high-level engagements between Afghanistan and Pakistan. There have frequently been joint statements that emerged from these high-level meetings with a lot of positive rhetoric, with pledges to work together, but then ultimately things don't seem to work out as well as they could. And I mean, as you well know, I mean, this is a very troubled relationship. And I think that while there may be these types of high-level engagements and high-level visits that result in new commitments to work closer together, there clearly are fundamental obstacles to the relationship that cannot magically go away even if you have some high-level meetings. One of them is just the trust factor for reasons that we know. The Duran line issue, of course, is another major issue that won't go away easily. That said, I think that the visit by the Pakistani Prime Minister was important because any increase in cooperation and new confidence building measures are critical right now, given that it appears that Pakistan is likely, especially with the US support, to have some type of facilitating role, even if indirect, in this broader peace and reconciliation process, given the leverage that Pakistan has over the Taliban. And if Pakistan will indeed be hanging around, so to speak, hanging around a peace process where the Afghan government is one of the key parties, then you would definitely, I think, we should welcome any type of improvement in Pakistan-Afghanistan relations. But in terms of Pakistan's role in the current violence and in the broader peace process, let me put it this way. I think that Pakistan is actually in a unique position and that it really is poised to benefit no matter how things play out in Afghanistan. So if the peace process succeeds, this means that there would presumably be some type of political settlement and the Taliban would hold some type of power under some type of undefined power sharing agreement. And that would be good for Pakistan's interests, because what does Pakistan want in Afghanistan? It wants a government that's friendly to Pakistan. But on the other hand, if the peace process flounders or if it fails, then certainly, I guess one could argue that this is not a good thing for Pakistan because of spillover effects like increased drug and refugee flows that Islamabad wouldn't want, and also because a worsening security situation in Afghanistan would strengthen the Taliban, leading to the possibility of it threatening to retake power. And this could embolden and inspire extremists in Pakistan, which is something that the Pakistani powers that be don't want. But I think that the Pakistani officials would not admit this, I'm sure, but Pakistan does benefit from a failed peace process on a strategic level, because the ongoing and presumably due to US withdrawal worsening war and violence in Afghanistan would ensure that the Taliban remains strong and potent, and that would help Pakistan ensure its access and influence in an increasingly troubled Afghanistan. So my point here is that Pakistan, I think, has no immediate incentive to sabotage a peace process that could bring it great strategic benefits if it's successful. But if things don't progress at the negotiating table, if the peace process doesn't go well, if the US withdrawal continues, things get dicier, that's when I think we could expect Pakistan to be more active, providing more direct support to the Taliban, including in operational activities that ramp up violence.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Mr. Shuja Jamal, would you like to comment on what Dr. Michael added?
Yes, and before I comment, thank you, Michael, for pointing out the threat of climate change. And that's something that doesn't see borders, although some countries will be affected more than others. And Afghanistan is unfortunately one of the more vulnerable countries to climate change, given, and as a reminder of the history, in 1999 and 2000, up until the tail end of the Taliban regime, Afghanistan was undergoing one of its worst droughts in recent memory. This was when many farmers lost all of their entire harvests. Mr. Mohammadi, if you were alive at that time, as I was, I recognize you're a few years younger than me. The already devastated economy was in a very terrible condition. Currently, and with the overthrow of the Taliban, the drought conditions actually recovered, the rainfalls improved. You could look at that as some sort of a divine metaphysical message. But over the last 2-3 years, also Afghanistan has been going through some droughts, very difficult conditions, especially in the west of the country. And so, yes, climate change adaptation, making sure that the country's, especially agricultural system, is resilient to climate effects are important, and the ongoing use of terrorism and violence by the Taliban is making that difficult. And yes, the other question was, what about air power? And that's an absolutely important question. I'll take you back to the 90s and parts of the 80s when the Mujahideen actually had what has become colloquially known in Afghanistan as Stinger missiles, also known by their acronym as MANPADS. These were shoulder-fired missiles in which, but also aerial defense systems, which the Mujahideen used to devastating effect against the Soviet army or the Afghan communist government's air forces. And so the only battlefield superiority that a movement group like the Taliban, which is increasingly reverting to conventional warfighting methods, is really aerial superiority. And so that is an important edge as we're trying to fight this. That is something that has come, has played a decisive role on many occasions in the past. It's something that we're working on so that we can actually boost the capabilities of the Afghan National Army's air forces. And that's something about which we are in ongoing conversations with our international partners to address and develop those forces. But that is an important thought. It's an important question. In addition to that, let me also add that the ability to surveil, especially aerial surveillance covering a larger territory of this country, is also important. That's another capability that we're working on. I think that's, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
I would also like to conclude by thanking both of you for taking your time in sharing with us these very crucial points as the violence grows in Afghanistan. So if you do not have any further comments, we will end here because of the fact that your time might be limited. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good time.